Welcome to Work in Progress, Conversations with Creators. I'm your host, Logan Roy Speitman. On today's program, I have with me Ed Kashi. This is his book, A Period in Time. It's really a compilation of his whole career in photojournalism, a National Geographic photographer for many years. Even if you don't know his name, you probably know his photographs. We had a wonderful conversation, and I hope that you enjoy.
If you enjoy our podcast, please like and subscribe and consider becoming a digital subscriber to the Albuquerque Journal to help us bring you more content like this. You can find this episode and all of our podcasts on the Albuquerque Journal website, abqjournal.com, as well as YouTube, iTunes, and Spotify. See the show notes for a discount code on a digital subscription. Thank you for supporting the Albuquerque Journal, New Mexico's leading news.
Hi, Ed. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Logan. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great. And you're in Amsterdam right now, visiting your daughter there.
Yeah, and going to be doing a workshop with National Geographic this coming weekend, but mainly to visit my daughter. No.
Well, that's great. You have a show up now at Monroe Gallery in Santa Fe, which kind of spans your entire career and goes along with this book, which is a nice big thick book that's also kind of your whole career in photos. It's beautiful, and I recommend it to everyone. So obviously we can't cover everything you've done, but you've worked mostly for National Geographic on assignment many times, and really created a lot of incredibly iconic photos that even people who maybe don't know your name, they've probably seen some of your photos. Maybe we can start with one of your earliest projects that you did, where you were documenting Protestants in Northern Ireland. One of the things that's striking when I look at those images, you focus a lot of the time, some of the photos are children. And I think seeing children who are growing up amidst conflict, and that there's a kind of contrast there, and that's emotionally powerful.
Yeah,
often. But
sure. So, that the work I did, I spent 3 years documenting the Protestant community in Northern Ireland at during the Troubles, as they were called. And for me, I felt like that part of the story was underreported, particularly to an American audience. It was my first real personal documentary project, where I really sort of invested my own time into creating something on my own. And as part of that work, at some point I realized it might be interesting to spend time with a bunch of 18-year-old male Protestants, who are from a working class neighborhood called Tigers Bay in North Belfast, because they essentially had grown up only knowing the Troubles or only knowing conflict. And in Northern Ireland, it's so intimate. Literally from boulevard, like street to street, you can go from Protestant to a Catholic community, and so they would live not only in fear, but with this idea that my neighbor is an aggressor potentially, or I might take out my aggression on them. So I specifically, as part of my overall body of work looking at this community, I thought it would be interesting to focus on this group of 18-year-old boys. And so that led me into a very intimate look into the community, which ultimately I was given, sort of, as I call them, fashion shows by the Protestant paramilitaries, where they would, put me in the backseat of a black taxi and put a hood over me and drive me around at night, and then throw me out in an alleyway, and there'd be, 3 balaclavaed guys with RPGs and machine guns posing, so I got that kind of access because I guess for that community, I'd proven that I was, trustworthy. So anyway, and then I guess as part of that, to address your question more directly, I was around a lot of kids. There are a lot of kids in these communities. So yeah, it set the stage also for kind of how I would work even up until this, 30, 40 years later, where I like going into communities, groups of people, and spend time, a period of years to do a deeper, examination of these communities. So while it's photojournalistic, it's also really truly documentary work.
Yeah, and I think that that's an important point, and probably that's why you're able to get some of these incredible images, because you do spend that time and really embed yourself in these communities, and you do have that level of trust. I think about, yeah, I mean, I was trained not in journalism. I studied art and writing, but also anthropology. And I think sometimes about the difference between kind of standard journalism, where you're often getting in and out very quickly, versus anthropology, where you do really more like what you're like. It's more of an anthropological project where anthropologists often spend years in a place, getting to know the people, and you get like a much deeper, richer kind of story that way, I think.
Absolutely, and I often will say that I'm in some ways as much of an anthropologist as I am as a journalist. While many of my projects have a journalistic edge, or they're topical, like oil in Nigeria, or whatever, Jewish settlers in the West Bank. I'm not a great news photographer, and frankly, I don't like working in situations where there's a lot of other media around. It always feels intrusive to me, and just for me, it makes me uncomfortable. I much prefer to work, where my subjects, or collaborators, as I like to call them, are my own, and I'm able to develop a direct relationship, however deep or however shallow it may be. Because one thing about doing this work is I can spend 5 minutes with someone and make an image where you thought I had looked deeply into their soul, but I can also spend days or weeks with people and never kind of get past the surface. It's a very mercurial kind of work, and so much of it is about the foibles of human behavior, and how we develop relationships with people, and all that. But yeah, so to me, it's one of the many reasons that I feel so fortunate that I've been able to have this long career in this field, where I get to really go deep with issues and subjects that I come to truly care about, and that I think that are important.
Yeah. Now, being kind of thrust into Northern Ireland during the Troubles, it must have been scary. Like you hadn't really been in that kind of situation before, I would imagine. Did you feel at any point that your life might actually be in danger?
No, if I did, I wasn't aware of it. I feel like there were a couple of times where there were riots, and the police came with their rubber bullets and armored personnel carriers. Those were times where I felt like it was getting a little dangerous. But and there were times where, like, some of these guys would get drunk and get pretty rowdy, but I don't know, I feel like I was shielded in a way, and maybe that's just an illusion, as I'm sure you've heard that or felt that in your own work, where the camera you feel is somehow a shield, however however unreal that is. But yeah, I never felt like truly threatened by the people. There have been other places in the world where I absolutely felt that way constantly, but there's something about, I don't know, the Irish also. It's like, there's certain cultures that once they accept you in to their fold, then they really take you in. And that's a
Yeah.
very beautiful thing about that culture, actually.
I mean, do you think that, though, like, could you have then embedded yourself with the Catholics after that, or they would have said, "Oh no, this guy's with the Protestants"?
No, that's interesting. I certainly could have. I could have, for sure. I think it might, in general, I think the Catholic community was a bit more politically savvy and aware of, like, the implications of things. And so I think they understood that journalists work both sides of the story. It's interesting because that was the before times. It's very different now to do this kind of work. It's
Well,
very different.
talk about that. How's it different?
Well, I think because of, social media and the internet and all that there's this much higher level of awareness. Also, which I think is fundamentally important for people to understand. It's like, ISIS doesn't need the Western media to cover it. You In some ways, they can put out their own propaganda, or Hamas or whatever. I mean, that these organizations, in some ways, don't need Western media to tell their story in the way back then it was sort of necessary and to a certain degree almost accepted. So again, certain communities, like I did a lot of work with Jewish settlers for a few years in the West Bank. They're pretty closed, and now they're very closed and actually potentially violent towards media. So some of this depends on the culture of the communities, the political situations. But I might be going a little astray here from your question, but so you can reel me back in. But
No, that's fine. Continue.
I
Yeah.
would, I would just say that doing this work is definitely harder now. Like there's a
Yeah.
certain like innocence when I was doing this in the 1990s that just doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
And also people now can look me up or whoever, whatever journalist or photographer is coming to their community, and they can find out, well, who is this guy? What's the work he's done? Maybe what are
Yeah.
his political leanings? What's his religion? What's his ethnicity? So it's a much trickier time in that way to do this work. You need to be really, really hyper aware of the information you put out on yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. And I imagine even with governments, there might be more scrutiny. They can also look you up and not give you clearance or access as well,
Absolutely,
right?
not give you a visa. Absolutely. Yeah.
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 You haven't experienced that yourself, those kind of issues.
No, I think the only visa I can remember being denied was to Saudi Arabia in 1992. I had an assignment for National Geographic on water problems in the Middle East, and for whatever reason, they would not grant a visa. Otherwise, in general, well, I will give you. This is not a visa issue, but this is a of the moment issue. So last year, my wife Julie Winokur, who's a writer and filmmaker, and we work a lot together. We pitched a story about a Harvard study in India about the impact of heat stress on female workers. And heat stress is an issue that now I've been doing work on for the last
Right.
few years. And we got fully funded. We got a Pulitzer Center grant, an NPPA grant, fully funded project to go to India. And because the Modi government is now cracking down on civil society organizations, this women's group who would have been our leads into this subject, they said, you cannot come now. So it wasn't that we were denied a visa, but in this case, because of, quite frankly, a more authoritarian government in India right now, they're cracking down on these civil society groups. They even, I think, kicked out one of the Harvard researchers. This is the kind of, I don't know if that's subtle or not, but these are the kinds of pressures now that we can face in these countries where the regimes are sort of shifting much more to the right, or in some ways are just clamping down on media. And in this case, I thought it was absurd. It's like, we're not going there to paint India in a negative light. In fact, we were sort of going there to show a novel program that is being developed to help mitigate heat stress among female workers. But such is the world we're living in now that some of those subtleties are lost when there are these sort of blanket actions by governments.
Sure. In the past, you have been able to take photographs in places with, I guess authoritarian is a loaded term, but for instance, there's that very, very famous photo that you have of the Kurdish woman in Turkey who's standing before, I guess it's like a military tribunal. Talk about that image. And I guess once you took that photo and it became kind of famous, then they didn't let anyone else
Right,
back in to do more.
Exactly. Again, talk about a more innocent time. In general, the Turkish military, I don't even think they have a public relations department, which is kind of interesting. I've always thought, like, to some degree, like, why should militaries tell everyone what they're about to do? But anyway, that's another comment. That's another issue. But in this case, the Turkish military is quite tight on media access. And I
And
think,
sorry, and this was back in like the early '90s, I think. Do
yeah,
you remember when?
1991.
Yeah,
And so, this was at not the height of the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, sort of violent, separatist movement within Turkey, the Kurdish cause, which was quite violent and destructive. Thousands of people died in this what, 30-year campaign. So this was sort of towards the beginning of it. And so the Turks were having these like terrorist courtrooms or tribunals, if you like, to try Kurds that are suspected members of the PKK. And I think I got in because I was following a Kurdish human rights lawyer. I sort of traipsed into the courtroom with him and made a few pictures that ended up being, a very significant image. But yeah, they shut that down after that image appeared in the magazine. As I said, they confiscated all the issues of the May 1992 issue of National Geographic within Turkey. Again, for journalists, this is just, and particularly for photographers, this is a constant sort of battle of, how much can we get away with it? Can we, how close can we get? What access, what can we access, and then what gets shut down, and we have to find other ways to gain access,
yeah,
but it's a very
and we
tricky moment. I will just say that. I mean, look at our own Pentagon, how the restrictions that they're trying to place on the media. So it's a very interesting and tricky moment right now for the media in general.
And I think right now, all around the world, I mean, there's been an increase in journalists being arrested, imprisoned, killed in some
Killed.
cases.
Yeah. Yeah. Particularly in Gaza. Yeah.
But I guess, I don't know, you've been around long enough, you've probably seen kind of waves of this in the past in different places.
Yeah, but nothing quite like this. I mean, certainly there are places to work like Russia, Mexico, for journalists where you really do risk your life. Even just doing reporting on corruption, just from the sort of business community, not even like the cartels or whatever, like that there are a lot of players and characters that just don't want you to stick your nose into their business. But honestly, what's happened in Gaza over the last 2 years is another level of like death to journalists that is somewhat unprecedented, quite frankly. But again, I would say in general, it's a really tricky time. I know colleagues. I've not worked in Ukraine, but a colleague of mine who works a lot with the New York Times as a photographer was saying, this the scariest thing is when you're driving down a highway and then you hear a drone overhead. So it's not even about like missiles or, bombardment from planes or artillery. It's just that a drone can take your car out because they suspect you being the enemy, or they just they know you're a journalist and they target you. It's, I don't do that kind of work anymore. I mean, I would do it if I was assigned it, but those aren't the kinds of stories that I'm looking to do at this point. But it's, I really, hats off to the people who are doing that work now. There's
Yeah.
a whole nother level of exposure, and risk that you're taking.
And do you ever feel like, or have you talked to other journalists that photojournalists that feel this way, that you take on all this risk going out there, risking your life to expose the truth or bring back a story, and then it's sometimes met with indifference? Have you had that experience?
Yeah, I mean, I've had that from my own kids, but with my work, as I like to say, I could have the cover of National Geographic and I'd have to bribe them to look at it. But that was then, not now. That was when they were teenagers. But I know it's a really important question, and it's a tough one to face, really, because it's a horrible thought. To think that the sacrifices and risks that journalists all over the world are making to bear witness, and to tell these important stories would somehow be met with indifference. But I truly believe that, part of human nature is we live for stories. And probably the most significant stories in some ways are about war and about violence, and about death. So I think to some degree it has to do with, how these stories are told and what channels they're disseminated in.
Yeah, and I
Uh,
and I think that also, this might be hopeful for some people. You can talk about you've actually seen work that you've done have a direct influence on policymakers, and things have changed because of your photographs. Maybe give one or two examples of that.
Yeah, so this is this idea of impact. And actually, just to circle back to a comment I made a minute ago, one of the reasons that I sort of stopped looking to work in conflict zones is that I just sort of felt like, unless it had to do with this project or the issue I was dealing with, it's like I just felt like my pictures weren't going to make a difference. And so in the time I have left on this earth, I want to focus my work on issues where I feel I can have impact. And I know that that is possible because, to your question, I and many of my colleagues have proven that. I mean, I've had work that was used to change, you know, again, not my work was a part of a much larger, just to be, clear here, a much
Sure.
larger initiative, that foundations or NGOs or lawmakers were spearheading, but the media materials I created were used to convince lawmakers to change laws or pass bills. But then there's on the more like individual, intimate level, where like an image I made in Nigeria, of a young boy working in a hellish abattoir, a slaughterhouse, compelled a woman in upstate New York to find him through her church and then start paying for him to go to school so he wouldn't have to work in that facility. My wife and I worked on a project in 2000 about a woman in Dallas who had had breast cancer and a double mastectomy. When the story appeared in the New York Times Magazine, within a month, she received $50,000 of donations. And I think now in the current moment, you've got, Indiegogo. I can't remember all the different funding sources that people use, to raise money when whatever something tragic befalls a family or that sort of a thing. So I guess the point I want to make is people do care. People are paying attention. That yes, there are many people who are tuned out, couldn't care less about other people, are selfish and all that. But there are so many people, and I'm talking about the United States now in particular, that do care. And if you tell good stories and you tell them in an authentic and sincere way, that you can reach people, you can penetrate their consciousness, and whether it's they donate money or they get involved by in actions, or at the very least you might change their mind about something, that's the reason we must do this work. And
Yeah,
so I
yeah.
I don't want people to think that, the game's over, nobody cares anymore. It is just not true.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important message because it is easy to get cynical or, and negative and not focus on what you've really experienced, which is that, photos have power, journalism has power. These things do change the world in, smaller or larger ways. So I want to talk a little bit about your work with the Kurds. This is a project you did over almost 15 years, I think.
30 years.
Oh, sorry, 30 years.
Yeah.
And in many different countries. And so tell us a little bit about which we talked a little bit about that one image in Turkey, but that whole project.
Yeah, so for me, interestingly, it was quite organic. I learned about the Kurds while I was working in Northern Ireland. So I love when like one personal project segues into another one. Excuse me. In the case of the Kurdish project, it was also it was a story that I pitched to National Geographic in 1991, and so it was my first big project for the magazine. So it was a great way to start, where it was something I really cared about, and then I was given this tremendous support that only National Geographic magazine could give. Where I went to 8 countries, not only in the Middle East, but in the Kurdish diaspora and Germany and the UK, and was really able to spend time, to tell a very deep story about this, what was the largest ethnic group in the world without a nation of their own. And the Kurds have the sort of geopolitical misfortune of being in what is now Iran, Iraq, Turkey, and Syria mainly. So, not the friendliest places for a minority group. And anyway, and so as I got more deeply into the story of the Kurds, it also brought me to the lands that my mother and father are from. My parents were born and raised in Baghdad in Iraq, and they had to flee because of religious persecution in 1940. And thank my father that he chose New York, and I got to be born and raised in New York. So I feel very fortunate in that way, even though it was a negative reason why they had to leave their homeland. But the Kurds brought me for the first time to that place. So on so many levels, telling the story of the Kurdish people has been so powerful for me, in that I've been able to sort of compile an archive of work about this group of people that is so important to the Middle East, and date back to the time of the Bible. They're considered the Medes, Medes. They're
Yeah.
mountain warriors. Salahuddin, who was the Islamic warrior that won Jerusalem back from the Crusaders, was a Kurd. There's just a very deep, rich history of the Kurdish people. And so, like Northern Ireland, but on another level, it was a chance to kind of become a mini expert on this subject. And then over the decades, I've continued to go back every so often. I was just there 2 weeks ago for a Kurdish cultural forum in the city of Suleimania in northern Iraq. And so, again, this is for me, this idea of living the sort of photographic life. It's just brought these tremendous richness. It's brought this tremendous richness to my life beyond the work and the career and the things associated with the career part of this. It's just so deep. And I would say for anyone who's listening who is thinking about being a journalist or a photojournalist or any kind of storyteller, there are these untold personal riches that you can gain besides the career element of it. And so I feel really fortunate, that I met this Kurdish woman in northern Ireland that led me to what has become like a lifelong pursuit.
Yeah, and even though you're focused on the Kurds, I mean, as you said, your family has ties to the region. You are Iraqi. Your last name Kashi, I think, is Persian. Am I
Well, yeah, it's interesting because it's also the original name of Varanasi in India.
right?
Yeah,
That's
that
right.
traces back 5,000 years. So, and it's also the original name of Kashgar in China in the Gobi Desert. So, it's an interesting, and my family was basically Arab Jewish or whatever, or Persian Jewish, but I know like Shiite Muslims from Iran whose last name is Kashi. So,
Yeah.
actually, it's a project I've wanted to do. I call it the arc of a name. Like how a name travels this huge breadth, but it's not. These are not good places to work in right now.
Not right now, but you have. I mean, you went to Iran, and what was
Yeah.
your experience there when you were there?
Well, it
And
was
when was that?
so that was part of the 1991 project on the Kurds, and it was brief. And I just went into the province of Kurdistan in Iran. I've not been to Tehran or Kashan, which is the city that they believe the name Kashi emanates from. But I mean, my experience in Iran was so brief and so tough because it even then it was such a police state. If you walked out on the street with a camera, people were immediately on you. What are you doing? All that. So you
Yeah.
had to have I had to have a minder with me. Uh, yeah, I don't know what it would be like there now, but I suspect it would also be quite difficult. Iran is not a place where you can wander around with a camera, is my understanding. And
Yeah.
I've
Yeah.
mentored some Iranian photographers who have sort of said that, it's really, really difficult to work there.
Yeah.
Which is such a shame because Iran is this huge, glorious history, that's part of human, civilization, really,
Yeah. I mean, they say what, Isfahan is half the world or whatever. It rhymes in Persian and,
Yeah,
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 incredible, glorious cultural history, but yeah, very difficult to access these days. Let me ask you, in your photos, often, you know, I mean, these aren't composed. You're out there in the world and you're framing things, but you're able to sometimes capture images that feel quite surreal, unusual juxtapositions of things. Maybe talk just a little bit about, um, I don't know, like, are you kind of looking for, or how, like, yeah, how does that happen? Like, you just notice this is a moment, this is the image that tells the story.
yeah. So there's a few ways that I approach making images. There's one approach which I've called the abandoned moment, which was my previous book. That was the title of it, and that's much more of like shooting from the hip, sort of working in a chaotic way. Not having the camera to my eye and just sort of dancing with what's around me. But most of the time I'm working in a more precise manner where I'm working as a visual storyteller, where I'm not, of course, I'm always looking for beautiful, great light and, great compositions and all that. But, as a storyteller and particularly as a photojournalist and a documentarian, what I'm trying to do is insert myself into situations that will have the sort of visual elements that will let me tell the story, or to make a
Yeah.
point, or as you say, to juxtapose things to make an even stronger point, or to heighten the drama, or not in an artificial way, but to capture the drama, to capture, the human emotion. That is always my goal, is really to have work that has power and impact. So I would say, really, as one of the great challenges of doing this kind of work is that most of the time we're not in control of the light, the people, the background. Like we're sort of battling to make some sort of hopefully aesthetic visual sense of what is a very unforgiving photographic reality.
Yeah, no, and it's quite extraordinary what you're able to do. Some of your photos, they remind me a little bit of like Andre Kertész, who I guess was kind of, well, anyway, an early, sort of. Would you say that he's sort of a founder of this kind of photography? I don't know. His work often had a bit of a surreal
Yeah.
feeling to it as well, that I
Well,
think sometimes yours does.
I'm honored to be compared to him, but him and, Cartier-Bresson, the early practitioners of 35 millimeter, like Leica photography in the 1930s, when this new, roll, like Kodak created the roll film and Leica created this incredible camera so that you were unfettered from one image at a time. You could actually work in a more flow with more of a flow, and so they were some of the first photographers to really experiment with street photography and playing with this sort of surrealism as well. I think it was also connected, like the Dadaist movement and surrealism of the 1930s. All that was coming together like at the same time. But yeah, so there's an element of that in my work, but I'm very much, for better or worse, I'm just dedicated. I want to make images that have impact, and I want to make images that people can understand. Even though some of my work might be more obtuse, if you like, or not connected to like a firm reality. In general, I put it to you this way: that in as with writers, they're poets and they're essayists. As a photographer, I am an essayist that occasionally might be able to lay down some poetry. But my aim is always to write that essay, to produce that essay, because I
Yeah.
want my work to be about something and to make a point and to have impact.
Yeah, yeah. And also, you focus on human emotions as well.
Sure.
How difficult is that to capture?
Well, I mean, it can be difficult at times, but it's what makes me feel alive. I mean, I like to say that my first choice of university was Michigan, but I didn't have good enough grades. But if I had gotten into the University of Michigan, I probably would be a therapist or an anthropologist now. But
Right.
that I've always been interested in people and humanity and the human condition, in politics and social issues from the time I was 10, 11, 12 years old. That was what me and my friends were about. Besides playing sports, it was about, really being tuned in to politics. And I think I'm a child of that time of the 60s and 70s, where people were really tuned in. They were
Yeah.
really tuned in.
No, it's fantastic. Anyway, you've done incredible things in your career. We don't have time to talk about all of them. You're going to Nigeria at the end of the
Yes,
month. Is that right?
on the 27th. So like in almost 2 weeks. Yep.
Which you said, you went there before and were documenting what was happening with oil and all of that. When was the
Yep.
last time you were back?
Nigeria, the last time I think was 2016, maybe. So it's been a while.
So,
Yeah.
so are you looking forward to? I know you're going for it's like a photo
A
fair
fest.
or a festival.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I have experimental film and photographic exhibitions being presented, and probably do some panel discussions and all that. Well, Nigeria is such an amazing place, so I'm always excited to go back there. This will be, I think, the first time I'm going there, and I'm not actually going there to photograph or make a film. So in that sense, it's a little less pressured. But and also Abuja, which is the capital, it's the Abuja Photo Festival, is, let's say, a much less chaotic city than Lagos, the main
Right.
big city of Nigeria. But
Yeah. So
yeah,
hopefully it'll be a little bit relaxing, I guess. Even if you're going to a place not to photograph, are you still photographing, or do you ever just put the camera away and say, I'm just here not shooting?
yeah, no. At this point, I won't bring a camera. I mean, I always have my phone with me, but which is quite a potent photographic tool. But no, I mean, for me, I need a break. Like
Yeah.
I've been doing this nonstop for over 40 years, and I'm at a point where, when I'm working, I'm all in, but then it's just good to have a break. It's a way
Yeah.
of like refreshing my mind, my heart, my eyes, but everyone's different. Some people, it's like they always have a camera with them,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, good. I hope you you hope you enjoy it and have a nice kind of restful time. And thank you so much for speaking with me. This is a real pleasure.
Well, thank you for having me. All right. Take care.